Regardless of your religion, the enormous impact this can have on your lives is undeniable. Christianity's gigantic role in human history. Today, there are over 2 billion Christians on the planet, nearly 1/3 of the global population. And wherever you look, you see clear signs of this presence, right? A cross on the wall, a Bible on the table, a parish on the corner, a cathedral in the city center, a street name, a pamphlet. A painting, a song, music, a statue, a TV series, a YouTube video, everything somehow refers to Christianity's central figure, which is Christ, right? Jesus of Nazareth. At least that's what they say. Because while on one hand, the historical evidence for the existence of Christianity is indeed infinite. On the other hand, historical evidence of the existence of its founder, Jesus, is much more limited. But they exist, and in this video we will take a look at these evidences and analyze how solid they are to support the claim that Jesus of Nazareth is the historical figure. Really, to do this, first we'll examine the archaeological evidence directly linked to Jesus, then the textual evidence divided into Greco-Roman, Jewish and Christian sources, and finally we're going to take stock of all this data and assess whether it is in fact conclusive. Or no tangible, concrete, solid evidence, like the deceased's remains or a tombstone bearing their name or a coin minted with their likeness while they were alive or something along those lines. Similar, but the issue is that this type of evidence is extremely rare. And when it exists is more because of people from the highest elite in society, which was not at all the case for Jesus, even so. Thus, even for elite members, this type of evidence is very rare. Until recently, we had no archaeological evidence, for instance, that validated the historical existence of Pontius Pilate. Pilate, who was the most powerful person in Judea during Jesus' time, we had no trace of his body, nor of his grave, nor seals, even nor of coins with his face or name, nor statues, nor anything. And there's been none of that I mentioned, right? But we've had it since 1966. Decades ago, an inscription on a wall in the city of Caesarea Maritima mentioned a certain Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, dedicating which indicated the construction, part of which is that wall, such as Tiberius. And as we already had textual evidence that there indeed was a prefect of Judea named Pontius Pilate. During the rule of an emperor named Tiberius, it's easy to understand this inscription and consider it indeed as solid evidence of the existence of this historical figure.
But that's
it, right?
This is the only archaeological evidence really
Straight to
directly
Pilate,
linked.
and again, right, we're talking here about the highest authority of the province
Judea,
of when Jesus supposedly existed. Now imagine then what would be reasonable to expect in terms of archaeological evidence about peasants from Nazareth, from the deepest countryside of this province, of the province of Judea. So archaeological evidence directly linked to Jesus. We have nothing, just as we have no archaeological evidence directly linked to practically none of his contemporaries and countrymen, including people who was
Much richer,
politically more influential than him. That's why we'll focus more on written sources throughout this video. Actually, before going to the written sources, there's an archaeological evidence, which is what comes closest to being something solid and concrete regarding Jesus, who occasionally comes up in discussions about the historical existence of this figure. That is this box right here that you see. This object here is an ossuary, which is a recycled one.
bridge.
Typical of Jewish burials from the 1st century. It was discovered in 2002, and what makes
Among
it
the
special?
various other ossuaries.
What we have from this context is an Aramaic inscription, which appears on one of its sides, saying the following: Next, Yaakov, son of Joseph, called Yeshu. That is, this could be the ossuary of James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Since this item was indeed dated from the 1st century AD, and it carries these three names together, James, Joseph, and Jesus, many people,
the Logos began to suspect that he might be the
the
bone.
actuary of James, called James the Just, who is a character that appears in the Bible as the brother of Jesus and son of. As a result, we would have concrete evidence of the existence of a brother of Jesus, which indirectly would be evidence of the general's existence. Indeed, it's not impossible, but also not very certain, because there are a number of details we have to consider in this story. The first detail is that these three names, James, Joseph, and Jesus, are among the most common male names in that context. Out of 147 male and female names found on ossuaries in the region, 19 are Joseph and 10 are James. These two names are even the most common male names in ossuaries, first and second place. A study showed that 14% of all Jewish names in this context were Aramaic variations of Joseph, Yosef, or Yerosem. existe mais neste e mais este yo. 9% were variations of Jesus, Yehoshua, and Yeshua. And 12% were Tiagos, right? Yakoke. And here we can translate Yaakov as James or Jacob. The origin of the name is the same as I've explained in a video here on the channel. And considering these numbers, historian André Lemaire, who was responsible for this study, he came to the conclusion that during this period of Roman domination in Judea, in which Jesus would have lived, there could have been about 20 men named James, Asaz, Maaz, Sis, and Sausish, who were children of some Hosean siblings, hands of some Jesus. And there is a second detail about this archaeological evidence, the James ossuary, which is as follows. Despite the ossuary being dated very securely as an object truly from the 1st century, and this through various forms of dating, including chemical dating, mas que Peijon, this inscription that appears on the ossuary may not be original. In fact, for a while, the collector who owns this object faced 44 forgery charges under his name, including one due to the ossuary. When this object was first submitted to a panel of experts, they even came to the conclusion that the inscription was fake, but recently a new examination gave a favorable opinion on the authenticity of the inscription. And anyway, even if this is authentic and this second panel of experts is more right than the first panel of experts, it still doesn't tell us if these uncle
James, Joseph, and Jesus who appear in the clothing.
These are exactly Tiago, Jose, and Jesus we are looking for, and this is just an example of how inconclusive and precarious can archaeological evidence be, no matter how solid and tangible as they may be. In the end, what really matters is not so much the object itself, but the interpretation of this object. And this interpretation relies on many other pieces of information, like those we find in different sources, which are extremely important for history, which are the written sources, and that's where we're going now. The oldest, most informative, most numerous sources we have about Jesus are the sources written by Christians. But obviously followers of Jesus are going to say that Jesus existed. So before we go to these sources, let's look at some other non-Christian authors, which give clues about the existence of Jesus. And we can start with the Romans, and among the Romans first, chronologically, we can talk about Pliny. Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, better known as Pliny the Younger. Young was a Roman senator and jurist who held various imperial positions throughout his life. What interests us most here is that Pliny was appointed governor of the Pontus province between the years 111, 118, and 118. During this time, Pliny exchanged many letters with Emperor Trajan, telling him what was happening in the region and asking for guidance on how to handle more specific issues. One of these letters, which is letter 96, is the oldest record we have today, from a Roman source explicitly mentioning the figure of Jesus. And the context of the letter is as follows. Pliny had been receiving several complaints against the presence and activity of Christians in his province, and he wasn't quite sure how to handle this new super-territorial contagious, which is how he refers to Christianity. He tells the emperor that so far, whenever someone was brought to him as a Christian, he forced people to invoke the Roman gods, worship images of the emperor and other gods, and to make offerings to these gods and to insult Christ. If the person was willing to do so, they were released, and if not, they were punished. Moreover, he also records that Christians always said they had not committed no crime to be taken to trial, and that their activities were simply holding periodic meetings where they sang hymns to Christ, almost as if he were a god. And that's basically what Pliny says then in his letter, and wherein the emperor responds to the letter, saying he didn't have very specific guidelines on this issue, but he advises Pliny not to actively seek out Christians, not accepting anonymous reports, but if someone brought a Christian to him for trial simply for being a Christian, this defendant should be forced to recant by worshipping the Roman gods, or else he would be punished. And we can get lots of interesting information from these letters. First, it becomes clear that Christianity was already a well-developed phenomenon at the start of the 2nd century, to the point of having reached Asia Minor, where it was the province of South Point. Another thing is that we can also see in these letters that Christianity was detested by part of the empire's population, and was indeed persecuted, at least sporadically. And third, and most importantly for the question of the historical existence of Jesus, is that this letter also suggests that at this early stage of Christianity, Christ was worshipped nearly as a god. At least those are the words that Pliny records. This almost is quite interesting, because it suggests that Christ was worshipped and that he received very high honors, but he was not seen exactly nor effectively like a being of the same kind as Zeus or Apollo. He was probably a man, someone who actually existed in flesh and blood, but he was not treated as a mere mortal. He was once again almost a god, but not quite. This testimony from Pliny, which comes from his interactions with Christians, whom he took and received, at least in court, trial already begins to offer some little pieces to our puzzle, but still, there are very few pieces. It says nothing, for example, about Christ's origin, what he did or what was done to him. In this what he simply says is that there was a movement that worshipped him. But some of these things that we don't find in Pliny can indeed be found in writings left by some of his contemporaries, like Tacitus and Suetonius, for example. Tullius, or Gaius Cornelius Tacitus, was a Roman senator who also held a series of imperial positions. And during his public performance, he wrote two very important historical works, which are the stories that cover the period from Nero's death to Domitian's death, and the Annals, which go back to the times of Tiberius and continue up to the reign of Nero. In this last book, dating around the year 120, there is an account of the famous fire of Rome. Tasso says this fire, which would have happened in July of 64, turned it into a wildfire. No, attributed by part of the population to Emperor Nero, but Nero, to get rid of this popular accusation, he shifted the blame to a group that was loathed in the city, whom the crowd called Christians, Christians,
or rather, Christian.
The text states the following: Nero cast the blame on others and punished them in unusual ways. Those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christian. Christian. The founder of a founder of this name, Christ, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator. From the orator Pontius Pilate suppressed for a time this deadly curse Christianity, and broke out again, not just in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all terrible and shameful things from everywhere meet and become popular. This document not only says a lot about early Christianity,
but it also says very important
about the
things.
figure of Christ himself. Christ, Tacitus records that Christ lived in the times of Tiberius, who was emperor from 14 to 36. It also says he was executed under Philip, governor of Judea, from 26 to 36. And it says that the movement that Christ started in Judea was already present in Rome. In 1864, it was considered by many as an evil and subversion, that is, an illegitimate cult. Okay, if you wrote these words at the beginning of the 2nd century, you certainly weren't a direct witness to almost any of it. But even if for some reason we do not want to fully accept the testimony of the taste style, still, there are some things that are pointless. Unmistakable. The first of them is that Christianity was, without a doubt, known in Rome at the beginning of the 19th century. Secondly, it was when Tacitus was writing. The second is that at least it was plausible for Tacitus and his audience that Christianity was already known in Rome before, around the middle of the 1st century, at the time of the Great Fire of Rome in 64. And third, this movement of Christians was attributed to a founding figure called Christ, who was described as a man, a flesh and blood man from the province of Judea, executed by the Roman authority around the year 30. Regarding the term Christians, just to not leave this up in the air, this is a spelling that appears in various ancient texts. Krestos or Krestos was a Greek-Roman given name derived from an adjective meaning good or bad. This name is very similar to the term Christos, which is a word in Greek, anointed, right? And translates the Hebrew term Mashiach or Messiah. Because of this, many non-Christian authors who are not familiar with Jewish messianism or Christian theology, they confuse this title, Christ, with a proper name. Krestos himself frequently, a Christian from the 4th century for example, who is Lactantius, even recorded his irritation with this mistake of ignorant people, as he calls this issue. Confusion. Another ancient source about Jesus that also makes this confusion between Krestos and Christos is Suetonius. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus.
He was also a Roman author who lived at the turn of the 1st century.
Or the 2nd century, and left a very important called The Lives of the 12 Caesars. This work contains the biographies of Roman rulers from Julius Caesar to Domitian, Neontis, Dinis Vasi, Bishop and his 51 and 50. We find another reference to Crestus, which is as follows. He glorious the emperors that expelled the Jews from Rome. vigiam. As the police ficavam vigiando, mas they were always causing disturbances due to the instigator Chrestus. As Chrestus, like I mentioned, was not a common Jewish name, but rather a common Greco-Roman name, it's unlikely that the Chrestus mentioned here in this passage is a Jew, and it's also unlikely that the instigator behind the disturbance among Jews if it were a non-Jew. Therefore, most historians today understand that this passage refers to disputes that occurred among Jews in Mycenaean forces in the return of the figure of Jesus, whom some accepted as the Messiah, the Christ, but the majority rejected it as always. An idolatry, right? As being a man worshipped there instead of... And these frictions then between the Jews who were becoming Christians and the Jews who were rejecting Christianity. They may have escalated to a point where Claudius decided to disperse the Jews from the city to prevent the possibility of more violent conflicts developing. And another passage in the life of the 12 Caesars which also refers to Christianity, and this is unquestionably, it refers to Christianity. This is that during Nero's biography there, the Suetonius writes, he says the following, punishments were applied to Christians. A class of people tied to a new and perverse multitude. This sentence appears in a section of Suetonius' text where he is listing the positive aspects of Nero. So Suetonius himself criticizes Nero a lot in various actions, but he praises the fact that Nero having persecuted there, it's possible that these mentioned punishments have some connection to the Great Fire of Rome referred to by the author. The author does not make this clear, and the curious thing here is that Suetonius in this passage writes Christians with an I, not an E. What led some historians to question why he has written Chrestus and not Christos in the first passage, if that character, the instigator Chrestus, was indeed the founder of Christianity. But the fact is that it is perfectly possible that Suetonius, who makes only these two very short references to Christianity in his work, may not have known the movement very well, and consequently he might have missed the connection between these terms, Christus and Christ. Christians, but anyway, this is yet another source pointing to the significant presence of Christians in Rome in the 1st century, at least during the government of Nero. And if we understand that the instigator Chrestus is indeed a reference to Christ, then this source points to the existence of Christianity even earlier, in the first half of the 1st century during the time of Claudius. Well, these are the three main ancient Greco-Roman sources on Christianity and on Christ, but before moving on to the Jewish sources, which are very interesting, also it's worth quickly mentioning two other later Greco-Roman sources, who also says quite curious things about Jesus. The first of these is a satirical text called The Death of Peregrine, written by Lucian.
The Samosa is around year 6.
365. In this text, Luciano tells the story of a man named Pilgrim who joined the Christian priests and scribes of Palestine and soon dominated the community. Pilgrim, according to Luciano, explains, published and commented on some sacred texts and even wrote some, the Crystals.
Christians took him as a prophet, leader of
Boss
civilization.
synagogue, and even as a god. He just wasn't worshipped by Christians more than a man from Palestine who was crucified for bringing this new form of initiation to the world. This text, as I said, is satire. It doesn't aim to be a specific document at all. Reliable history, and its main goal is actually to make fun of the figure of a pilgrim of Pariah who was a contemporary of Lucian, and incidentally make fun of Christianity, which Lucian considered to be the height of credulity. On this matter, he even states in the text that Christians have convinced themselves they are immortal and will live forever, that they despise death and willingly embrace it, and that they worship the crucified sophist who taught them to deny the Greek gods. And all these Christians would be accepted solely by faith without any evidence. So this is according to Lucian. If a cunning and crafty person who knows how to take advantage of the situation comes among them, among the Christians, that person can get rich quickly. Meanwhile,
Laugh at those foolish people.
and again, this is a fictional text, but it's a fictional text that comments on something from the reality of the 2nd century, and therefore, regardless,
on the merits or demerits of Lucia's opinion.
If I don't know about Christianity, the
it
fact
states that this text serves as yet another testimony to the tradition that Christianity emerged from the teachings of Hog, Moses,
teachings of a flesh and blood
who
man,
was crucified,
and it's also a testimony that the followers of this man, the Christians, were being executed during Luciano's times because of their beliefs and way of life. Well, and finally, to wrap up the main Greco-Roman sources about Jesus, we have a source a bit later than the Life of a Pilgrim, which is a treatise called True Doctrine. Op de Zaze Aire Siap Kwasaniting, written by Celso, who was a doctor and Neoplatonist philosopher. This work is also against Christianity, but it's quite different from Luciano's text. It doesn't aim to be satire, rather a direct accusation against the foundations of Christianity, like for example, its antiquity, its legitimacy, its morality, and its authenticity. And it is in this context of accusations that Celso will say a number of things about Jesus, which would be harmful there to Christianity. He mentions, for instance, that Jesus was the son of a poor peasant woman, which would have been seen as a discredit in Celso's view, the founder of Christianity. He also says that this poor peasant woman got pregnant with Jesus in an adultery with a Roman soldier named Pantera, and says that, and to hide this, Jesus would have invented the story that he was born of a virgin. Wow, let's embark within us. Greek, a word that reminds us of panther. Furthermore, Celso says that the miracles Jesus supposedly performed were actually sorcery learned in Egypt, and that, as Jesus was very proud, the pride in those powers he learned in Egypt, he gave himself the title of the tough one. Even though this source has a clearly anti-Christian bias, it's interesting to note that at no point Celso raises the possibility of Jesus not having existed, which actually makes it provide other explanations for Christians' positive claims. So, for example, he says that Jesus had power. Yes, but it was Egyptian witchcraft. He says there were rumors that Jesus was born of a virgin, but that was to cover up his mother's adultery. He also said that people did indeed consider Jesus to be God. But this was actually a wild rumor, and a proud one that Jesus himself might have created. So despite turning Christianity upside down, heaven seems to never doubt at any moment. Traditions about Jesus likely have some basis in a real, historical, flesh and blood person. And how about this? Important Greco-Roman sources about Jesus, and about early Christianity. But as I've already hinted, these aren't the only non-Christian sources we have to evaluate the question of Jesus' historicity.
There are also some very interesting Jewish sources.
Things we should consider from now on. The first of these sources might be the main non-Christian source on the topic of Jesus' historical existence. O coisa 12 hoje is known as Jesus, who is the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Josephus was actually born Yosef ben Matityahu and led Jewish forces against the Romans in Galilee in the post from the Roman-Jewish wars. But after surrendering and being captured by his opponents, Joseph started cooperating with them and adopted Roman and Flavius is the correct one. In this phase, he accepted the patronage of the imperial family and began writing a historical work about the war he had just participated in, which was published as the War of the Jews. Around the year 75, quase deve de Vavs. After that, he went on to write a second very important work called Jewish Antiquities, which tells the history of the Jewish people from Adam and Eve to the revolt against the revolution. And it's in that last work in Jewish Antiquities published by... In the year 94, he makes twice, I must say again, then. In 94, he makes two very important references. Regarding Jesus, it's worth starting with the second reference made in Book 20 of the Antiquities, which is shorter.
And less controversy.
This one is the first, so we quickly get through this second meal. What this second reference says is that a high priest, during a gap in the Roman administration period in the province of Judea, this over there in the 60s, gathered the council of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. After accusing them of law breaking, he, that high priest, handed them over to be stoned.
This passage then gives evidence
about a man from Judea named Jesus who was called Christ and had a brother named James who was stoned in the 60s. And we have an independent source from the 2nd century, which is the chronicler Hegesippus, who also says that James, the brother of Jesus, who appears there in the New Testament, was stoned during that time in the 60s. So it's quite likely that this historical figure mentioned by Josephus, Jesus, called Christ, brother of Jesus. James, be it the same Jesus from the New Testament, the Jesus worshipped by Christians, and not generic Jesus. And well, this is the second reference that Josephus makes to Jesus, which is quite short indeed. But there's an earlier reference to this that Josephus makes in the Jewish Antiquities. Much stronger, much more detailed than that. So strong, so detailed indeed, which is considered considered quite suspicious. This first reference appears in Book 18 of Jewish Antiquities, which is known in the debate about the existence of Jesus. Like the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius Josephus, and it's so important that it's worth quoting the passage here in full. What Josephus says is this: "At that time lived Jesus, a wise man, if it is indeed correct to call him a man, for he performs amazing feats. And he was a master to those who accepted the truth with pleasure. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah." Pilate, with the issue was that when he heard him being accused by our leaders, condemned him to the cross. But those who had initially loved him did not cease to love him, for on the third day he appeared to them again alive. Because the divine prophets had predicted this and countless other things about him. Even today, the tribe of Christians named after him did not disappear. If we were to fully accept the authenticity of this document, we would have a first century Jew born and raised in Judea testifying that Jesus existed, that he was a man recognized as a miracle worker and as the Messiah. And even more so that Jesus would have been denounced by Jewish leaderships and executed by crucifixion by the Roman authorities. And that after that he would have been seen resurrected and would have left a large number of Jewish followers.
And not Jews.
That matches a lot with the New Testament.
The issue is that this testament aligns so much with the New Testament, with the Christian writings, that it seems to be indeed a Christian writing, at least in some parts.
Quartz.
For instance, that
The
Jesus
text
was the
says
Messiah.
that-
He did not say that they said Jesus was the Messiah, but he
That he was indeed the Messiah, and a statement of that kind.
it would only make sense if Josephus had converted to Christianity, which is something that is not corroborated by another aspect of his works. Moreover, other sections question if it is indeed correct to call him a man, or he appeared to them again alive, or even the divine prophets had prophesied about him. All these sections also fall into this same issue, right? Jose Alpha would have had to become a Christian. It's that we unfortunately do not have the originals of this text. To check if those passages, those statements were originally there, the oldest records we have of the testimony in Flavian were produced and preserved by Christians in the 4th century, and it's significant that Christians from the 2nd and 3rd century who knew Josephus's work, they have never referred to this specific passage, not even in their apologetic texts that try to offer as many arguments and evidence in favor of Christianity as possible. It's hard to believe that if this passage already existed in their time, they wouldn't have made use of it. That's why today most historians believe this passage was not real, was inscribed, at least not entirely by Joseph, but rather by Christian scribes during the copying process and reproduction. Now, as I've already hinted, this doesn't mean the entire passage is made up. Much of the text has the style and vocabulary of Josephus. Fits very well into the overall context of the work. So what many historians suggest is that a neutral passage might have actually been written by Josephus, but later on, this passage ended up receiving interpolations made by Christians, and this neutral passage would be something like this. Thus, at that time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he performed astonishing deeds and was a teacher to those who joyfully accepted the truth. He won many Jews and many foreigners. When he heard being accused by our leaders, they condemned the cross, but those who initially loved him did not stop loving him. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared. So if at least this core is considered authentic, the testimony of Josephus, who lived in Judea and may have even witnessed the early stages of Christianity's development, it remains a very important source to answer this question of the historical existence of Jesus, even if we exclude it from him. In those most problematic passages, well, besides Josephus, we also have other ancient Jewish texts talking about Jesus, but all of them have the same issue. But let's look at the text first, and then we discuss what that problem is. These other texts are in two different documents, which are the Talmud and Toledot Yeshua. The Talmud is a collection of rabbinic texts that were written and compiled to preserve Jewish translations.
After the destruction of
And
Jerusalem,
the scattering of the Jews in the context of the Roman-Jewish wars. Among these texts, we have some mentions of a certain Yeshu, who did extraordinary things and ended up being executed.
because those mentions are
The
not at
passage,
all
for example,
positive.
says this born on the eve perspectiva vista,
It was
em
in
februari
September.
Oktober 10.
They hanged Yeshu.
A herald went before him for 40 days proclaiming he will be stoned for practicing
And
magic.
led to its
If anyone
existence.
finds something
Won't
in their
you?
favor, let them come forward and plead for it. But nothing was found in his favor and he was lost.
They hanged him.
Expensive on the eve of Passover.
Another document, which is the Toledot Yeshu.
It also brings some statements to that effect, that Jesus, or Yerba, was a sorcerer who violated the Jewish laws and customs and ended up ibifazam quaca causa being hanged for it. He also says that Jesus was born from an extramarital relationship between his mother and a man called Panther, that he performed many miracles by improperly using the letters of the unspeakable name of God, and that his disciples tried to hide his body to say that he ascended to heaven. Both Toledot and Exu and the passages about Jesus in the Talmud, obviously are part of a set. The context of controversies there among Jews and Christians of antiquity. In the case of Toledot Yeshu, actually, we are already in the Middle Ages. The oldest version we have of this text is from the 9th century. The Talmud is definitely much older than this, but it's hard to date each part of it very accurately, right? It's a collection of texts that gradually took its current form, mainly between then and now. And the 6th century, either way, both sources are very late and therefore have a very slim chance of recording past events. But if that's the case, why am I bringing these sources here? The thing is, even though these sources are late, it's possible that they do indeed record. Some really old traditions about Jesus. The Toledot Yeshu, for instance, said Jesus was the son of a man named Pantera. Something that Celso, as we saw in the 7th century, exactly it also said. And the Talmud says that Jesus learned sorcery in Egypt, which is another thing we also find in Celso. But it's highly unlikely that these Jewish sources were directly based on the text of the Roman doctor Celso, because there are many disagreements among,
For example,
assumed
it says
heaven.
Matus made
Oh
a
my
living
God,
from his sister.
Basambu composing Iswoko boys weaving fabrics. The Talmud already mentioned she was a hairdresser. Celso states that Jesus' father, Pantera, was a romantic soldier.
Boom.
The Toledot and Exu already say that Pantera was a Jew from the tribe of Judah. So it is much more likely that both Celso and these Jewish sources must be based on non-critical oral translations. Distance. And no matter how biased these sources may be, they at least bear witness that the Jewish opposition to Christianity was happening.
Often by slandering the image of God.
Jesus, never through questioning its historical existence. By saying Jesus was a bad person, for example, they are at least admitting Jesus was a person. Well, and taking advantage of the fact that we're talking about biased sources here, we can't end this discussion without considering the main set of existing sources on Jesus. What the New Testament is, the sources that Christians themselves wrote in support of their tradition, their belief. Often when asked about the sources that exist, to test the historical existence of Jesus. Jesus, the tendency is to respond just as we started the video doing so, according to that are so out of. This is because the goal of the Bible, or at least of the New Testament, more precisely in this case, is to promote Christianity and maximize the importance of Jesus. So consequently, the New Testament texts cannot be read as neutral and impartial historical records. They have a very clear side in this story, history. But this means those texts aren't useless for historical research. The truth is, no source is completely neutral and unbiased. Not those that made it into the Bible, no, those left out. Every author has their own biases. And faced with this, in light of a biased text, what historians do is not discard the text, but the text, but engage in critical reading from the text without immediately accepting everything it says. But considering the possibility there in each point of the text, be educational, or not compared with other evidence we have available, as it available. And that's what historians do when they read the New Testament, and that's what they do when they read Josephus, Lutacio, or any other philosopher. So before making a final assessment of the historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth, it's worth taking at least a quick look here. In some texts.
Christians, and we can start talking.
Do this with Paul's letters, which are the oldest texts we have about Jesus. 13 are letters attributed to the Apostle Paul.
God bless
Most
you.
historians agree that at least 7 letters were definitely written by Paul. No? 3 letters may have been written by him, and 3 letters most likely were not written by him, they are false attributions. So, to stay on firmer ground here, I will refer only to what is in the 7 most accepted letters, as authentic dating from around the 1950s of the 1st century. In these letters, Paul unquestionably refers to Jesus as having been a flesh and blood man, born of a woman, had siblings, made disciples in life, was judged by Jews from the Judea province, executed by crucifixion, was buried. Paul himself admits to not having met Jesus in life, but he writes to people who supposedly did meet Jesus when he was alive, and Paul it also records various situations with Pedro and other apostles who lived with Jesus, including his time with Ant, and water. And
right?
of Jesus,
a brother, and all these
people were supposedly alive there when Paul was writing in those letters. So even if one may disagree with Paul's view of Jesus that he was indeed the Messiah, the Son,
Son of God, someone who seeks
he
the
rose
Lord.
from the dead and is said to come back to end history as we know it. It's hard to imagine he got it wrong or made it up, right? The one who
the
talked
fact
about
that, for
Jesus,
instance, I had one
brother,
alive who was the church leader
in Jerusalem, while Paul was doing his activities, his preaching, and who was a character even with whom Paul seems to have disagreed on many points. So if Paul had been inventing Jesus, would he invent a brother, for example, for him who was alive and was on a certain level even an adversary of Paul for doctrinal definitions of the context? And of course, Paul is not the only author who talks about Jesus, his disciples, and his family, actually including this isn't even the primary goal of Paul's letters, to talk about the history of Jesus. He is far more concerned with doctrinal definitions and church organization issues. The New Testament texts primarily interested in telling the story of Jesus are the Gospels. And these offer even more clues to the questions we're exploring here. The Gospels seem to follow Paul's letters, usually dated around the year 60, 70 to about year 90. Some few historians place the Gospel of Mark much earlier, and is in year 40. This would make it the oldest source about Jesus, even older than Paul's letters, and some historians place other Gospels, like the Gospel of Luke after the Apocalypse. Year 100. These datings are always very complicated because we do not have the originals of any
these texts, right? What
it's
again?
Not at all surprising. In the field of ancient history, we also do not have the
from
origins.
Tacitus Annals, nor from Pliny's letters, nor from the lives of
Nor
blood.
the Antiquities of Josephus, nor the Talmud, nor practice. Nothing at all. For instance, the oldest existing edition of the Tastorines is a Germanic manuscript from the 12th century. The 10th and the oldest edition of the Lives of Suetonius is a French manuscript from the 19th century, a 9th. But even though we do not have the originals, it is possible to know that these texts are much older because they are translated into
noticed
English.
that they are mentioned in earlier documents, indoors, and also
the analysis
by
of its style, its vocabulary, the historical references it makes. From the context he assumes is known by his readers and so on. There are various ways to date a text without having the originals, sometimes more accurately, sometimes not so much. And just out of curiosity, regarding the Gospels, the oldest material evidence we have of any of them is a tiny fragment with parts of the Gospel of Jesus
from John,
dating from the early 2nd century, so this Gospel is certainly before that, but it's hard to say for sure. Unsure how old. Well, to make the situation even more complicated, if that's even possible. It is clear that the Gospels are texts based on earlier sources. The Gospel of Luke even says this explicitly, starting with the following words. Seeing that many have already tried to compose a narration of the events that have been fulfilled among us, as those who were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word from the beginning have handed down to us, it seemed good to me also, after having followed all things closely for some time, everything from the beginning to write to you in an orderly way. For this
Noble Theophilus,
to verify the soundness of the teachings you have received. But even more interesting than these evidences,
Explicit tendencies to sources prior to the Gospels
are the implicit evidence.
It's just an
to
example
succeed.
here that I think is
This
worth
was
it.
one of the most interesting examples.
In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is seen criticizing a group of Jews for tithing mint, rue, and all kinds of herbs, but neglecting justice and the love of God. And in the Gospel of Matthew, there is a very similar passage in which Jesus makes the same critique. But here it says dill instead of rue, and says dida mercy, color of loyalty instead of love of God. These variations might seem
That's kind of relevant,
at first
you know?
glance, it might seem uninteresting, but there's something very intriguing behind words like deal and rue, and love and mercy. They are practically identical and can be easily confused with each other. I mean, in Portuguese, obviously, they don't look like each other at all. And not even in Greek, the original language of these Gospels, scales, do they look anything alike? But in Aramaic, which was the language spoken in the region where Jesus would have lived, they are practically, and this suggests with all likelihood that this story used by the authors of the Gospel of Luke,
And Matthew may have come from
earlier
a
than
source
Michael.
in
At some point in
Athens.
the transmission of this source, a minor confusion has occurred.
And these two variants have an outcome.
And there are several other similar cases, and cases too where parables only make sense. When translated back into Aramaic, it means even though there are only 4 first-century Gospels about Jesus, which would already be quite a lot by ancient history standards, gives many clues that there were others. Other earlier sources that didn't make it to us, didn't survive over time. Well, and finally, we could also mention other Christian sources that possibly record ancient traditions about Jesus not found in the New Testament, like the Apocryphal Gospels, for instance, or the Christian authors who wrote at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century, like Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch, and of the writings of Heraclitus. But then we start to move a bit further away from the times when Jesus would have lived. And if the arguments from Paul and the evangelists are not considered convincing enough, the arguments from later Christian authors won't be either, so I think we can already here in walking towards the conclusion of this entire history. So, did Jesus exist or not? Are the evidences enough? And the answer is it depends on what each considers sufficient, comparing with what is expected in the field of ancient history. The evidence presented here is more than enough to consider that. Thus, it is entirely possible that a man named Jesus, who lived in Judea during Pilate's time, the tales that he made disciples and was executed, actually existed. The overwhelming majority of historians, whether atheists, Jews, Christians, Muslims, or of any belief or disbelief, do they believe in the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth? Does this mean it's absolutely proven then with 100% certainty that Jesus existed? No, it just means that the level of plausibility of Jesus' existence is very high. It's 100% certainty we can't have about the existence of no character from the times of Jesus, right? Maybe no Emperor Tiberius existed, maybe his statues and coins are a hoax. The text mentioning this emperor might be fabricated or interpolated. It's impossible to prove with 100% certainty that Emperor Tiberius wasn't the product of a past conspiracy. So yes, it's possible to raise that hypothesis. But it's reasonable to raise that in the field of law we talk about the standard of property. Beyond reasonable doubt, right? I mean, something can be considered proven even if there are doubts about the issue, because in any legal case, just like in history, there will always be room for some doubt. The issue is doubt. This doubt is reasonable. It is reasonable to consider insufficient
Historical
evidence of Jesus' existence, and at the same time considering
The
itself
evidence of existence
historical
is
record of
sufficient.
Socrates, for instance, who is only mentioned by 3 contemporary authors, and that there is also no archaeological evidence directly tied to him, or even worse in the case of Pythagoras. Pythagoras is not mentioned by any no contemporary source, neither Kojus, Pisa, Mazinkanwish, neither archaeological nor textual, none, 0. And yet, not so many people doubt the existence of Pythagoras or that. Well, but someone might say this, right? But Pythagoras is at least a more believable character than Jesus. No one said he performed miracles or extravagant things beyond our scientific knowledge, right?
To the list. But that's not true, is
The
it?
ancient texts we have about Pythagoras say he had a golden thigh, which was something that showed he was
Son
feminine.
of the god Apollo. They also say he
With
flies.
the help of a fan who
magic
had access to
arrow,
the world of the dead,
and
which
who-
was seen by people at the same time in different places, and maybe at this point you want to dismiss the existence of Pythagoras and Alexander the Great. We have many statues, coins, inscriptions, numerous texts about Alexander the Great. We already have contemporaries
written about him from different regions and
So
peoples.
if someone doubts this character,
of his
he
existence,
really doesn't leave anyone else in ancient history. And about Alexander, some ancient authors say he was born from Zeus's visit to his mother in the form of a bear. Others say
there
that
was
he,
a sister who was a
others say he
mermaid.
was carried by 2 griffins in the middle. Think
high the sky to see the world from behind.
above. And even the Talmud mentions
In
extraordinary
the area
things.
about Alexander is saying, for instance, that he
The
visited
Garden of Eden. So this means Alexander the Great could not have existed. There couldn't have been a historical Alexander. Of course not, right? The fact that absolutely extraordinary, legendary, or mythical things are attributed to certain figures, it doesn't mean they didn't exist. It might just be that the biography of these characters was exaggerated.
nothing, neither embellished
not even
by
sanctified.
people who admired or worshipped that figure, to say there was a historical Jesus and that historical sources are enough to support
Don't forget to
this.
subscribe to
This
the channel.
doesn't mean by any means to say that history confirms the New Testament, or that history confirms that Jesus actually rose from the dead or cured diseases with the touch of his hand, or
Demonstrate
that he had the power to.
of Lermont.
What historical research allows us to say about Jesus is much more limited than that. Not by chance historians who answer yes with all conviction. По подзю суля певиса дзинка извов уж